Popular atheist YouTuber PoZ normally engages in meme argumentation, meaning that he uses lots of humor and pretty shallow arguments for atheism in trying to expose the Christian worldview. That said, he did put out some videos asking some sincere questions of the Christian, and I'll be covering those videos as I put these out. And the first one I want to cover was his first one, 7 questions for the Christian. And I like this because he came across as very sincere and genuinely wanted to know answers to these questions and believes that this can start a fruitful dialogue between a Christian and a non-believer. So tonight I'm going to address some of those questions, and I want to see if I can reasonably answer those questions to my own satisfaction, let alone an atheist's. I think these questions are good and they're worth thinking on. So after watching this video, maybe take some time, look at the questions yourself, and see what you get out of them. Before he starts, he does offer some advice in actually dialoguing with Christians, and I think those are really good points of advice that even Christians should remember. So here they are.
Remember to keep your attitude calm and friendly. Be tactful, but sincerely tactful, not manipulatively diplomatic. Recognize that these might get the Christian to think, but it will take time for them to sink in, and they won't always lead the person where you'd expect. And most of all, come ready to listen, with your primary goal being to better understand the person you're speaking to. Anything less will result in you impatiently trying to rush the conversation to your own conclusions and, frankly, will be disrespectful.
Here are the questions. Let's see how I do.
Number 1. When did you become a Christian and why? Now, this is a pretty obvious question, and it's one I would ask a Christian to honestly consider when discussing their faith.
Towards the end of the video, he's going to ask a question specifically about Christian testimony, so I don't want to delve into that too much, but this question itself does ask for a certain degree of testimony. In my own case, I did grow up fundamentalist Baptist, and if you know what I mean, you know exactly how extreme that is. Those of you who might not be familiar with that culture, you have probably heard of Steven Anderson. If you haven't, he's definitely worth looking up. But that is exactly the kind of church that I grew up in. He's most famous for saying that he wished Barack Obama would die in office, saying that homosexuals should be executed by the government and that they should just kill themselves. He has said many egregious things, but those were the few things that seemed to really catch national attention. But that was absolutely the kind of culture that I came across, and not just those extreme things that they would say, but also the way he dresses, the suit and ties to church on Sunday, pretty much just piano music. If it's not written before 1900, then it's not really a Christian song kind of mentality. And this idea that the only acceptable version of the Bible, at least in English, is the King James Version, which was written in 1611. If you're not familiar with that, think William Shakespeare. That's the kind of language that it uses. So if you struggled getting through Shakespeare in high school, you would definitely struggle with going through the King James. In my teens, got really involved in the martial art of Aikido. And there is a huge spiritual aspect to Aikido that is really impossible to divorce from the practice itself. And I got involved in that practice, in those rituals and those movements, I guess, is the best word to use, of Shintoism. And eventually I started looking at Shintoism itself, and it's a very naturalistic, very nature-focused religious belief, very similar to shamanism. And that is a belief that I can pretty easily reject outright. I don't assign any deity to nature itself. Nature, you can see it working through a process. You can see it winding down. Even an atheist can agree with me on this. There's no way to assign any sort of divinity to nature itself. Nature, according to the Christian, is going to be the result of a deity. According to the naturalist, it's a result of random chance. But either way, nature itself doesn't have any special properties that set it aside from humanity. It's not in itself divine. After that, I became a Reformed Baptist. I had never really let go of the Baptist beliefs. It was just something I'd kind of explored as a teenager. So I hung on to the Baptist belief and became a Reformed Christian. I'm not going to go into the theology of that, but yeah, the Baptist beliefs that I grew up with and that were ingrained in me were absolutely there, and I was convinced they were true, probably in large part because that's what I grew up with. Today, I am a practicing Catholic, and you might think, well, it's still pretty much in the same category of religion, but as a Baptist, particularly having grown up as a fundamentalist Baptist, you do not believe that Catholics are Christians. You, in fact, believe that Catholics go to hell by virtue of being Catholics. It's the lowest form of any religion. I sometimes feel that most Baptists would prefer Satanists or atheists or anything other than a Catholic. Catholics are the worst. But I began to read church history. I began to question the theology that I assumed, and really focused on what did the Bible actually say? What did the earliest Christians actually believe? And I discovered Eastern Orthodoxy Catholicism, and I ultimately went with Catholicism, even though my buddy here is an Eastern Orthodox. So that's a pretty big change. You might still think, well, Jesus is Jesus in both, but like I said, it's a pretty massive change, and that took a lot of research on my part, a lot of letting go, and also a lot of risk taking. My family, it's fundamentalist Baptist. They don't believe Catholics are going to be in heaven, and that was something I had to struggle with. As far as researching other religions, which is kind of a point that he's making here, is, well, did you just grow up with Christianity and therefore you are a Christian? Or if you're in India, most likely you grew up with Hinduism and you're a Hindu. Or if you live further north, you might be a Muslim because you grew up in a Muslim family. And it seems like mostly a fair point that you're going to believe what you grew up with, but that is a fallacy known as a genetic fallacy. Where you start doesn't matter. Truth is truth, whether you grew up believing it or you discovered it later or you never discovered it at all. The truth is going to be what it is. That said, other religions, I did look into Hinduism and Buddhism to a degree. I don't want to get too personal here, but my former spouse was a professing Christian and attended Baptist churches with me and that sort of thing. And she eventually left Christianity altogether and pursued kind of a hodgepodge of Eastern beliefs, Hinduism, Buddhism, general New Age beliefs. And she didn't really have a category that she put herself in. And I don't think it'd be really fair to put her in a category because it was kind of what she felt was the best of everything. But I wanted to understand and be able to have conversations with her. So I did do some homework into those other belief systems. Hinduism, I feel that Occam's razor pretty much eliminates Hinduism. They have thousands of gods, and Occam's razor eliminates polytheism completely. Occam's razor is the principle that simple is correct, complex is not. That said, Buddhism, the idea that both pleasure and pain, both happiness and suffering, are both equally good and equally bad because they're neither. All that has to do with your attachment to this natural world. And I think that our common sense and our intuition can tell us that's false. And that's why I reject Buddhism. I mean, it's all vastly more complicated than that. I recognize that I'm being unfair to these other belief systems. Um, One reason why I reject Islam is its timeline and its own claims about itself. Um, it borrows heavily from Judaism and Christianity. Like I said, I know I'm being unfair to these religious systems. They're vastly more complicated, and this is just to answer some brief questions from Prophet Azad.
Sure, they probably didn't do so because they heard amazing arguments for God, and I doubt they chose Christianity after a careful exploration of multiple religions. However, you're not going to immediately convince a Christian of this, and doing so shouldn't be your goal. But maybe you can get the juices flowing so that, over time, they start introspecting more about a process they might not have thought a lot about. And who knows, maybe you'll come away with a richer understanding of the person and their faith journey as well. If you're not ready for that, indeed seeking it, I'd say you're not ready to be an honest, respectful participant in the conversation.
With this point completely, you gotta understand who you're talking to before you can have an effective conversation. Don't wait for your turn to talk. Listen. Actually listen to what they have to say. This can be true whether you're talking to an atheist or a Muslim or a Buddhist or whatever. Whoever you run across. Listen to where they're coming from. Understand them. Then you can have the most effective conversation. You know what direction to go.
Number 2. What role have arguments for the existence of God played in your understanding of your faith? I find this a good follow-up to the previous question, as I honestly don't think arguments for God have changed many people's minds about anything. In general, I see apologetics mainly as after-the-fact rationalizations designed to help people feel better about what they already believe.
It is a pretty fair question. Back in my Baptist days, I was really into creationist apologetics, arguing against evolution, arguing against billions of years. And were those arguments super effective? Generally, no. No, I can admit that most of those arguments weren't super effective arguments. However, they did validate my belief in a young Earth. I do think some of those arguments are still effective, and they're worth exploring. You should definitely at least look into the arguments fairly before you simply dismiss them. However, most of those were simply made to make you feel good about the position you'd already taken. And that is absolutely not the point of apologetics. If you're doing it for attention or to justify a position that you have, or to avoid having a real conversation, creating what they call a straw man, an easy atheist target for you to beat up, you are completely missing the point of apologetics. That said, there are things that have impacted me as far as apologetics go. I've had to struggle with my faith when things didn't go right in my life, when things don't go right in my life, and there's lots of room for doubt. And you think, whoa, if I just have enough faith, everything will just turn out, and then it doesn't. Because the Bible certainly never promises that things will just turn out for you, no matter how great your faith is. There needs to be a reason beyond that. 1 Peter 3:15 tells us to always be ready for an answer for the hope that's in us. No matter what's going on, we should have that hope, and people should want to know what that hope is. Going back to a personal testimony that you can offer. Apologetics arguments are, again, useful to answering those questions. When an atheist has an objection, you have an answer. When a Buddhist has an objection, and I've encountered that, you have an answer. Even if that answer is, I need to learn more about that, at least you have a sincere answer. Never try to make up an answer. If you don't actually know the answer, don't keep going. Go ahead and admit that you don't know. I used an example of how apologetics has helped me with Occam's razor. That is an actual principle that scientists and philosophers alike use in their reasoning. The simplest answer is the correct one. And that comes from theology and apologetics. That comes from William of Ockham. So there is a place for it. They have helped me.
So I'd suggest instead asking questions that might get them thinking about the role apologetics have played in their faith journey, such as, when did you first start hearing arguments for God? Which arguments have you found most compelling? How have they affected your thinking? Were they what actually led you to Christianity, or did they otherwise significantly define your Christian beliefs? Or did they mainly just reinforce what you already believed?
An example in my own life for this, my journey to Catholicism was based entirely around apologetics. It was historical apologetics. It was theological apologetics. Not so much philosophical or broad general apologetics that is used with atheism, but it was a very specific type of apologetics that led me away from my very foundational Baptist belief to believing something that I had been told my whole life would send me to hell. That's pretty significant. Even if it's not an atheist to Christian journey, it is still a pretty significant journey, and I think it would be fair to recognize that.
Number 3. Do you think similar forms of argument, or any line of argumentation, would get you to consider the existence of a different God? Or of any non-Christian supernatural phenomenon? If argumentation changed their mind about Christianity, might they have potential to get argued into Islam, or Buddhism, or New Age religions, or UFOs, or any number of other things? And wouldn't they be curious to investigate this possibility?
Well, yes. As far as general arguments for God, you can come to theism and become a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim, a Jew. There's so many directions general theism takes you, because you also have monotheism, polytheism, and pantheism. And you got to explore those things with equal vigor as you do with Christianity. It's the right thing to do. It's the fair thing to do. And I think it'll actually end up strengthening your faith in Christianity, because you'll realize Christianity has all the answers. It fills in the gaps of the other religions. There can be lots of truth in other religions. Islam has a lot of truth. Buddhism has a lot of truth. Hinduism has a lot of truth. Shintoism has a lot of truth. Even Norse pagan mythology can have a lot of truth in it. But Christianity has the fullness of that truth. And if another religion can show me a man who claimed to be God was executed, rose again after 3 days, with a strong historical evidence that was discussed in one of my previous videos, and then attested immediately afterwards, written down within decades, despite the fact that most people were illiterate and writing was very, very expensive. And I'll be getting to that point in another video, in another response video. He has 5 questions for apologists where he addresses this. And yeah, I'm going to be ready to answer that. Do we have that kind of evidence for Buddha? No. We know some of the details of his life. We know roughly when he was born and when he died. But most of the stories about him, most of the miracles, especially the miracles, weren't written until not just years, not just decades later, but centuries later. That's a good indication that those miracles aren't real. Whereas Jesus' miracles were spoken of while the disciples were alive, while people who witnessed them were alive. You also have saints within Christianity, particularly within Catholicism, where people talk about the miracles that the saint could do, but the first mention of any such miracles come 150, 200 years after the saint died. Yeah, that miracle probably did not happen. So we have to be fair that way. That's what makes Jesus so unique across religions. Well, one of the reasons he's so unique. There's many, many reasons we can talk about, but that's moving beyond the point of this video.
Notice I've never said anything about evidence. I've always referred to arguments. There's a reason apologists have to use lines of arguments for God instead of showing us evidence. And there's a reason arguments for God could be used to argue for practically any other religion or phenomenon. But that's a lot to unpack right now.
When it comes to the resurrection, I use the word evidence, and I stick by that word. You should definitely go back to some of the old videos, or better yet, watch the debate between Trent Horn and Matt Dillahunty, and you'll see a fantastic debate with evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Number 4. How do you account for testimonials from other religions? This flows pretty naturally from question 3, in that both ask Christians to think about whether the things that reinforce their beliefs don't reinforce other religious beliefs as well.
The first thing that needs to be said here is that God can and does work in every religion. He will work in every religion. Whether that brings them to a saving knowledge of God is another matter. I used to be an exclusivist. If you don't explicitly know the name Jesus and who he was, then you are not saved. I have become an inclusivist. A great person who advocated for the inclusivist position was C.S. Lewis. God looks at the heart. God looks at the person. He doesn't look at what men look at. He knows what's in the heart. He knows what their motives were. And God can decide who gets to go to heaven. And we don't. Therefore, I do think that God will work in other religions. God will work in an atheist's life. He will make himself known. It's what people do with that knowledge, with that information, that matters. But overall, I don't put a lot of weight into personal testimony. Testimony is something that's great for Christians to share with each other. It's great to encourage each other with your testimony. People who are maybe on the fence about what they think and what they believe, you can share your testimony with them. But if you're engaging with an atheist or someone of another religion, your testimony probably won't hold much water. This is where you can really see Prophet Azad probably engages mostly with evangelical Christians, because they're the ones who are really into sharing the testimony and look what awesome things happened in my life since I became a Christian. Look at this awesome Christian community. Whereas that's not really of value to someone who's not already a Christian. So that's my response to other religious testimony. I believe Christianity has the fullness of truth, and there's truths in other religion. I believe Christians experience the fullness of God, whereas other religions experience God.
Number 5. Where did you get your understanding of atheists? In my experience, very few Christians have interacted with openly identifying atheists. So pretty much their entire idea of us and of atheism comes from things they've learned within Christianity.
Growing up, for me, this was certainly true. I had an idea of what an atheist was like, but I grew up in that staunch fundamentalist society that there was really no room for knowing any atheists at all. And when I got older and started meeting more people, especially in school as a teenager, where it was kind of hip to buck conservatism and to buck Christianity and that sort of thing, that was when I had my first real exposure to atheists. But it was basically meme arguments. I don't think the flying spaghetti monster was around yet, but it was kind of that same concept where it was just these silly little word tricks to try to make you think, wow, my God is no different than a flying spaghetti monster. And that was kind of my early exposure, and I obviously didn't take that very seriously. And after that, my beliefs in how an atheist thinks and acts came from people like C.S. Lewis. It wasn't until the invention of YouTube, sometime later, when lectures started getting uploaded, that I had a real exposure to what atheists thought. And my very first serious atheist thinker was Christopher Hitchens. And if you're going to have an atheist thinker influence you, make it Christopher Hitchens. That is one of the most brilliant men who has lived in the past 200 years. He was something else. And his brother was actually a theist. So I hope and pray, along with many, many other Christians, that by the end of his life he did become a Christian. But that seems unlikely. Um, that said, I had that exposure to him and to Richard Dawkins. I read The God Delusion, and alongside it, I was reading William Lane Craig, so I kind of had that. I had a little bit of a balance with the obvious bias towards the Christian perspective. My first real interaction, like real life interactions with atheists outside of the meme atheists from high school, was at work. I remember there was a tool rep when I worked at Home Depot. He was an atheist, and he would have lots of conversations with me. And there was mostly New Age people that I interacted with, because I live in a small town in Colorado, and it's all about New Age spirituality. That is what most people around here fall into. They have some weird hodgepodge of Eastern religions and crystals and Norse ruins and you know the type. It's almost a stereotype around here. That said, there were atheists that I interacted with, mostly the college educated ones. When I was in college, most of the people I went to school with just didn't believe in God, or at least said they didn't believe in God, and seemed to reject the idea out of hand. And so it turned into a lot of conversations, and I'd have to answer some tough questions that these people would ask me. Then when I lived in Phoenix, I worked with a guy. My boss was actually a strident atheist. Like, he was just, he had nothing good to say about religious people, particularly Christians. And he and I had some pretty intense conversations, and that was good. He was really, really smart guy, so that those conversations really helped my thinking a lot. And every job I've had interactions with at least one person who claimed to be an atheist. And I've had to be able to answer questions. And I've also learned questions that are helpful and that are not helpful. And one thing I've always noticed is that when it comes to morality, by the end of the conversation, I've gotten every single atheist to admit that they have no basis to say what Hitler did was wrong. And someone like Prophet Azad might say, well, I can definitely give you a good reason. And I'm sure he can. He's a very intelligent person. Someone like Christopher Hitchens, very intelligent, and rejected the idea that he needed God for morality. But for most atheists, I've had real life interactions with them. I've had real conversations with them. And I can tell you, I believe it does fall short with just basic common sense.
Number 6. Have you ever felt the presence of God? If so, what does it feel like, and how do you distinguish it from the emotional or calming experiences that accompany music or meditation? Many evangelicals would say that they're not in a religion, and that they instead have a relationship with God. So this being the case, they must interact with Him, and this interaction largely comes in the form of feeling His presence, depending of course on the denomination, church, and person. In fact, God's presence is what defines His existence and personality for many of them, to the extent that it's said you can argue apologetics all day long, but in the end you can't explain away the experience of God.
Oh, yeah, he totally makes that comment about different denominations and variations within Christianity. But the fact is, he is definitely engaged mostly with evangelicals with a charismatic bent. Your classic non-denominational Baptist-like church. A lot of the mega churches is where you see this kind of thing from. And it's those churches that get so much media exposure that it's no surprise that's where he knows a lot about Christianity. That's the sort of Christianity he's familiar with. I don't put any stock in that kind of feeling. There are times where I have prayed and felt emotional, and there are times where I have prayed and felt peace, and there's times where I've prayed and felt anger. So I don't really, I'm not super quick to attribute those things to God necessarily. God is our creator. He gave us our emotions. He gave us our feelings. He gave us everything that we experience. When we encounter those emotions, we are in some extent encountering God by virtue of him having created us and having given us those emotions for us to feel, for us to experience. When we when you listen to that music and you are moved emotionally, I believe that does speak to God. Even if we can psychologically explain why we feel emotion around music, it touches us. It does something to us. And when we feel those experiences with our music, with our prayers, with our meditation, we are having a God encounter. Not in the sense that the charismatics and the evangelicals are talking about. Not in this vague way of emotions being an experience with God, that they themselves are God speaking to us. I mean, because God made us with those emotions, we experience them. Now, does that count as any kind of evidence against atheism? No, this is just my thoughts based on what I believe of what the Bible tells us. So as far as evidence goes, do our feelings mean anything? No, they don't. We gotta care about what's true, what's irrational, and not about our feelings. Because when the feeling goes away, when you start going to church and you no longer get that church high, are you still going to be a Christian? If there's no more emotion involved, are you still going to be a Christian? That's a difficult question to answer. Unless you've taken the time to think out your faith.
Number 7. How do you distinguish the voice of God from your own thoughts? Feeling God's presence often just amounts to emotional communion with God and assurance He's with you, and not much more needs to come of it. Thinking you've actually heard directions from God is a totally different animal. For most Christians, God's voice comes in the form of impressions or suggestions. It takes preparation to start receiving them, and they're trained to use discernment to sort His voice from their own. But why would God communicate this way? If He has important things to say to you and wants to be sure you hear Him correctly, why make you go through this process that has potential for you mistaking your thoughts for His voice and vice versa? And if discernment enters into the picture, by what process do you filter God's thoughts from your own?
Evangelicals love trying to discern God's evangelicals love trying to discern God's voice, especially charismatics and Pentecostals. Then when you jump that fence over to the New Apostolic Reformation, those extreme word of faith Pentecostal, speaking in tongues, fire tunnels, grave sucking, you go into that territory, and that's all they do is talk about hearing God's voice. And God's, in those cases, they'll talk about God audibly speaking to them. They can actually hear His voice. Jesus appears in the bedroom. Obviously, He's not taking it that far, but wow, that sect of Christianity exists, and I feel like He'd have a field day with them if He took some time on that end. That said, yeah, the impressions, the feelings that you get trying to discern what God's voice is and just what your own thought is. In the video, he suggests that most Christians will find their grounding in Scripture and seek the counsel of wiser, older Christians. And that both those things are great advice, actually. I would, for the most part, agree that, yeah, that is how Christians go about doing that. And he offers a good objection to that, which is that basically you're finding validation as to whether your own thoughts are good ideas or bad ideas. And that might even be true to an extent. I don't think Christians should be seeking to get that impression or really get that voice of God. God made you a free creature. don't think God's going to interfere too much. When you see the miracles in the Bible, and it's like, wow, it seems like every other page there's some kind of miracle. You have to remember the Bible is written over thousands of years. And there are millions of lives that intersect in the Bible. And then when you look at the number of people who experience miracles, you can count them. You can count them in a few minutes. The prophets, the disciples, Jesus. There's not that many people that actually heard God's voice. There's not that many people who actually experienced miracles. It's a rare, rare thing. It's a miracle. And if you think that it's just going to happen all the time, then you haven't actually been paying attention to the Bible at all. Jesus even blesses those who don't look for miracles and don't experience those kind of things, but believe. It would be so much easier if God did just give us a miracle. Or at least so Prophet Azad would seem to suggest. But the fact is, I don't think they would believe, even if someone came back from the dead. Well, that wraps it up for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far and you liked the video, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button. That really helps my channel out a lot. If you didn't like it, feel free to give me the thumbs down. Of course, I don't like getting thumbs down, but let me know what I did wrong. Put it in the comments. Give me that thumbs down, and I will try to improve next time. And in fairness, I don't think disagreeing with me is a good reason, but do what you got to do, right? Anyways, we'll see you next time. I'm going to be doing a video on the 5 questions he has for apologists, and I'm looking forward to doing that one even more than I did this one.